Hello, everybody. My name is Jorge Gerizati, and I want to welcome you to another of our alumni dialogues organized by Alumni for Liberty. In this occasion, we are partnering with the United Nations Development Program, and to them, we are extremely grateful because we believe that the subject of food insecurity is not one that we should take it slightly, because it's one that is affecting millions of people throughout the world, and especially in countries like mine, Venezuela, in developing countries. So in this session, we will be discussing the relationship of issues such as the supply chain disruptions that we have, the move towards resource nationalism that many countries are doing. We will discuss the effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and we'll discuss all these geopolitical factors and how they affect food security. After addressing these challenges, of course, the idea is to then see which type of solutions we can formulate and we can bring, so we can at least mitigate some of these problems. As you can see, this is the second alumni dialogue that we organized. The first one, a month ago, was in partnership with King's College London. In that one, we talk about the foreign policy of authoritarian states and how authoritarian states work together to circumvent diplomatic pressures from the international community. So as you can see, what we are trying to do with this series of alumni dialogues is to bring together members of our association and policymakers and academics so we can discuss these very important international issues. And of course, then we can try to address it and bring solutions. So I want to thank you once again to all of you who are watching the session, either live or YouTube or in Zoom or in Instagram or recorded. I also want to thank once again the United Nations Development Program for partnering with us and for working with us on putting together this session. And I want to thank the panelists, all the panelists and the moderator for being part of this session. Because it means that you care about this issue that is affecting millions of people. So, with that being said, welcome to the session and welcome to another alumni dialogue.
Alumni for Liberty webinar on geopolitics of food and freedom in the world. This is the second in the series of alumni dialogues, but this is in partnership with the United Nations Development Program. As we start off, we have, as you know, a fantastic panelist to discuss on this topic. But before we begin, a short video will be played. Then after that, we carry on. Okay, so I got information that we will proceed without the short video, but basically, so I will just do, we'll just carry on. So we're discussing today on geopolitics of food and freedom in the world. We know that across the world, food is increasingly becoming an issue of geopolitical concern. And today we see that global food security, we have global food insecurity. And what we are seeing that in a multipolar world, facing international conflicts and great levels of systemic uncertainty, we're seeing some nations turn to resource nationalism, restricting exports, as a way out, which implies that government is increasingly playing a prominent role in the support or ownership and management of natural resources and commodities, like food commodities. So in this dialogue today, We have guests, some SFL alumni will be analyzing the situation of food in the world, role of free markets in food system sustainability, and how the free market can enhance freedom in countries facing rise in poverty and food insecurity. Before we begin, let me introduce the panelists one after the other. We have Mr. Ricardo Goschok, who is a senior economist at the United Nations. He is a former research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, where he co-directed the MPhil Development Studies and convened the MA Globalization and Development. He holds a BA in economics, an MA and PhD in economics. He is also the author of the book, International Leaders and Investors' Behavior, What the Markets Tell Us We Didn't Know. We also have Mr. Jose Luis Chicoma, who is the former Minister of Production in Peru. He has also held the position of Executive Director at the Mexican research think tank, Ethos Public Policy Lab, which supports sustainable agriculture and development. He acted as the editor and project manager for the book, Transforming Our Food Systems, Inspirational Stories and Proposals, and was a key figure in the Tortilla Alliance, the Mexican Hack-Tech Network, and other alliances that backed wholesome and sustainable food systems. He frequently publishes and lectures about the connection between food and politics around the world. And he has held several important posts in the Peruvian government, including that of Director of Export Promotion from Peru, and Vice Minister of Small and Medium Enterprises and Industries. Welcome, Jose. We also have Alexander Hammond, who is the Director of the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity and a Free Trade Fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. He is also a Senior Fellow at African Liberty and Fellow at Epicenter. And lastly, we have J.P. Bastos. He's a PhD candidate at the Texas Tech University's Department of Agricultural and Applied Economics and a research assistant at the Free Market Institute. J.P. Bastos was also a member of the Instituto Atlantos board. He previously held a position as a policy analyst in the city of Porto Alegre in Brazil, where he had the opportunity to work on significant economic reforms. His research interests include public choice, populism in Latin America, political economy, and the economics of corruption. Welcome, J.P. Bastos. And I am also, as a moderator today, my name is Lanre Peter Ilo, a Nigerian think tank, Omnira Initiative for Economic Advancement, where our mission is to advance solutions to contemporary African issues. We do this by strategic engagement with stakeholders, publications, videos, and other events. So we're going into our discussion proper now. In case you do not know, Alumni Dialogues is an event that this is the second of the series, an event of the Alumni for Liberty, of the Students for Liberty. So you're welcome and thanks for joining. Now, I want each of the panelists to tell us their thesis or premise or opinion or thoughts. What are your thoughts about the geopolitics of food and freedom in the world? I'd like to begin with Mr. Ricardo.
Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Chair and Moderator. I was not expecting to be the first. Let's go. So basically, well, first of all, thank you very much, you, the organizers, for inviting me to, or not me, but the UNDP, to participate in this webinar. And well, basically, how long can I be in these initial words? So, but in any case, let me just say that
just make it brief. 1-2 minutes.
Brief.
We still have a lot of questions too. Yeah.
Okay, no worries. I just wanted to say first that given the current context we are in today, all these geopolitical tensions in the world, and being a representative of the UN here in this panel, that I thought it would be a good idea within the broader theme of geopolitics of food, that I focus on the topic of conflict, war, and food security, and in connection with that, food trade and inflation. And I think that basically the point perhaps I would be making as I speak is to talk about free trade, right? And also to touch on the issue of freedom, because my understanding is that we kind of see these two things as almost the same: freedom, free trade. I see, if you take freedom, which is something that we see as something inherently good, a good thing, I don't know, what we could say is that free trade in a sense is one manifestation of freedom, okay? But the point I want to make is that freedom itself is not necessarily a conduit to free trade. So perhaps I'll be making that point as I speak, that for free trade, we'll need a lot of diplomacy, a lot of multilateralism. We need global rules. We live in a globalized world, and for free trade, we need global rules. We need global agreements. So that's the points I'll be making as I speak today. So I just wanted perhaps to problematize, or perhaps not problematize, but to bring a nuance between the relationship between freedom and free trade. So that's what I can say for now. Thank you very much, Chair and moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Ricardo. Jose, what are your thoughts about the geopolitics? I read about you, and I see that you've done quite a lot in the area of food systems and food security. So what are your thoughts about the geopolitics of food and freedom in the world?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting conversation. I'll just use a couple of minutes to talk about how I see the world of global food systems. I actually appreciate that you invite me to this panel, knowing that I bring a different perspective to the table. I consider that some of the main problems in global food systems are related to markets that have been uncontrolled and unregulated for many decades. Now, this has led us to a world where we have frequent global food crises that move millions of people to suffer hunger and undernutrition, in some cases overnight. No, so, and this has a lot to do with free markets. One of the issues that is related with this is this, actually, like Professor Jennifer Clapp, that does research on global food systems, has pointed this out repeatedly, and in a recent paper also. But this world has led us to a very high concentration in global food systems in at least 3 levels. One level is the concentration in a few products. We now get more than half of our calories from just 4 crops, and more than 90% of our calories from just 30 crops. This is ridiculous when we consider that we produce hundreds of crops and food products that are edible and that could provide us with more diverse and nutritious diets. And quickly, I'll just focus in 2 other levels of concentration. One is that we concentrate food production on a small number of countries that export staple crops, in many cases, to the most poor and food insecure countries. Of course, this is evident in the current crisis, where we have realized the high dependency that many countries have on Ukrainian and Russian crops, and that this dependency makes them vulnerable to suffer hunger and undernutrition when these food supply chains are disrupted, as is happening right now. And this situation represents a terrible and cruel paradox in cases where, for example, in Africa, many countries are experiencing the worst food crisis in years because of this high dependency on food import. But at the same time, native African crops like sorghum and millet have been underutilized for decades. These crops are, in many cases, drought resistant, nutritious, easy to grow in many countries of the region, not in all, but are the casualties of a globalization of diets. And this high import dependency and homogenization of diets is in many ways the result of free trade agreements that haven't considered that agriculture, especially the sector that produces food for domestic consumption, requires some special protection. And the third level of concentration, and I end my initial remarks with this, is a high level of concentration in a few firms in global supply chains. The production of our industrial agricultural inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, and herbicides is concentrated in a small number of giant corporations, but also global grain trade is also dominated by a small number of firms. And in the last few decades, this trade has been prone to speculation and instability. And this has led us to unprecedented levels of food prices volatility that, of course, has affected millions of people who suddenly see their lives changed because they can't afford basic food products. IPES Food has published a report earlier this year that has pointed out that these price shocks are clearly being exacerbated by dysfunctions in global grain markets, including this commodity speculation. This is one of the reasons that global food systems are prone to crises that make millions of people suffer. Thank you.
That's an interesting submission, Jose, but we'll get to the questioning later. Alex, what are your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me, Lanre, and it's a pleasure to be on a panel of such esteemed guests. So in some ways, I actually do agree with Jose's opinion that, or matter of fact, I should say, that many states are highly dependent on one or two countries for a large proportion of the food they import and the food they eat overall. And with a Russian invasion of Ukraine, that's become evident, and the effects on East Africa, particularly, and indeed the rest of the continent, but East Africa especially, have been severe. But the way to, in my opinion, to overcome that isn't through greater protectionism, which therefore shifts your reliance on one or two external countries to one single country, which would be your own. Instead, it would be through much greater liberalization. I think if the last couple of years, both COVID and the Ukrainian crisis have taught us anything, it's if we need to have the supply chains as spread out through as many different countries as possible. So if disaster in one place occurs, it doesn't have a domino effect and take out so many other countries in the process. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine having a huge impact on East Africa. We want to have it so East Africa also imports lots of food from West Africa or Europe or South America too. So having a much more diverse supply chain, I think, is quite important. And that's why Africa has quite a few issues. Average tariffs are extremely high. I think the average tariff, not on agriculture, but just in general, is 5.5%. In Jose's native Peru, and I think it's less than 1%, the average tariff applied rate. So I think that's where we are. I think it'll be an interesting conversation to continue, especially as we go into the questions about the best ways in which we can reduce reliance on one or two states. But the way to do it is certainly not through greater protectionism, which means reliance on your own single state. Thank you.
Thanks for that interesting submission as well, Alex. JP, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here discussing the topic. I think that I very much enjoyed Alex's opinion on the fact. I think that food markets are notoriously problematic. I think the issues of concentration, as Jose Luis mentioned are indeed a problem. But I think that, as Alex suggested, the solution to this issue is not to concentrate and to turn to more protectionism. Food markets are problematic, but they are notoriously problematic because of governments. And so you see that in many countries, the countries who suffer more from food crises are countries who have low levels of economic freedom, are countries who have poorly defined property rights, and these rights are not protected. There are countries who have, in contracts, are weakly enforced. And on the other hand, we see that these big companies who are profiting from this poorly developed countries are usually doing so with the help of their governments in their home countries. So the food market is notoriously, or agriculture more generally, is dominated by rent-seeking subsidies, and these companies are profiting either from other countries or from people in their own countries by getting tax breaks, getting subsidies, and getting money from the government in their countries, and using that to perhaps arguably doing a unfair competition because they have help from their governments, which the local markets often don't. So I think that government's a big problem in this sector.
Thank you, JP, for your submission as well. You all have made interesting submissions from the need to diversify supply chain, food supply chain, to the need for open markets, and so on. And here's to the audience. Please, you can put your questions in the chat box for any of the panelists. But this is my first question, and is to any of you. What is the connection between food, geopolitics, and economic freedom? Anyone? Jose, you want to give that a shot? What's the connection between food, geopolitics, and economic freedom?
I'll take a round at this. One of the main issues related with the uneven global trade agreements in the world has been like the most powerful countries have been able to impose an agenda that protected more their farmers. And that is related with an uneven, of course, set of rules in these global trade agreements that have included in agriculture recently, no? Like recently, I mean in the last 3 decades, and a little bit more. But what I wanted to say related with that was that the promotion of the most powerful organizations all over the world, development banks, and the most powerful governments all over the world to food crisis like the one that we're living right now has been to increase trade, even if it was unfair. But even if it was fair, one of the answers was to increase trade, also to increase production, and also to increase specialization in what we produce better, no? And that has resulted in a world that is very highly vulnerable. And since you were talking about my own country, Peru is like one of the cases, one of the 17 mega diverse countries in the world. No, it has 2 important centers of origin and diversity: the Andes and the Amazon. We actually are proud that we gave the world potatoes, quinoa, chiles, tomatoes. No, and it also has one of the richest oceans in the planet. No, but even if we're one of the most mega diverse countries in the world, half of our population is food insecure, and we are more prone to crisis now than before. Now that our markets are open, Now that we're specialized on like big agro-industrial sectors of fruits, fresh fruits and vegetables, and that free trade agreements have actually promoted those sectors. But these free trade agreements have also affected the small-scale agriculture and food producers that actually feed most of the population. And this has been the result of decades all over the world, in the developing world, of structural economic reforms in the developing world mostly, that have ignored the role that small-scale food producers play in feeding our populations. And because we have ignored that role by not supporting them from the state, we have not used an opportunity to strengthen their capabilities, to promote innovation in that small-scale food producers, so they can feed most of the population and reduce the vulnerability that we have in many of these developing countries. So I think that actually what we should do all over the world is to make these small-scale food producers a priority. But that hasn't been the priority recommended by many development banks and the most powerful governments. They recommend to liberalize economies without considering the support that these particular sectors that have an importance on feeding the population have.
Thank you, Jose. I particularly like that you mentioned that we need to prioritize small food producers. We need to prioritize support for small farmers, food producers in different countries across the world. This is going to, my next question is for Mr. Gottschalk. A 2009 report of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations says that the world produces more food, enough food for everyone on the planet. Yet, we are unable to end global hunger. What can you say is responsible for this?
Okay, now thank you very much for your question, Chair. I just wanted to say first that I like what I've heard so far. I liked what I've heard from Jose Luis Chicoma. I think it's important that we diversify food production to incentivize local production. I don't have any problems with that. I'm not so sure that there is so much opposing views from what I've heard. To what extent there is perhaps a conflict between what, say, Jose is proposing or saying and what the other panelists are talking about free trade. It's unclear to me whether we're just talking about opposing views or whether it's possible to complement them. Now, on your question, I thought that we'd be talking today a lot about food insecurity. That's very important. And that's why I chose to talk about, to focus on the current conflict between the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because that is creating a lot of risk to food security around the world. That's a big problem, as we know. Given that I'm sitting here in South Africa, it's important to say that that has had a major impact in Africa, on African countries, brought a lot of threats to food security, especially among the poorest and the most vulnerable in Africa. So I think it's very important to talk about that. But one interesting thing is that the two main channels through which the crisis is impacting on the poor and most vulnerable one, or on these countries, African countries, for example, but also other countries around the world. And one is, of course, the fact that these countries import directly from the countries in conflict. I'm not going to go through the figures. I can talk about that later if you want, but they import a lot. And the other channel, of course, is the price channel. Now, one interesting thing I want to make, point I want to make, is that although if you look at, you know, African countries, I have some data here. Let me see if I find it. So, for example, if you look at Africa as a whole, and that's based on statistics from UNCTAD. UNCTAD is a UN agency based in Geneva. UN agency based in Geneva, Switzerland. And if you look at the data for Africa, Africa as a whole, 44% of its wheat imports come from Russia and Ukraine. For 25 African countries, over a third of the wheat imports comes from these two countries. For South Africa, the country where I'm sitting here, nearly 40%, and for the 15 African countries, over half of the imports comes from these two countries. Now, the interesting thing is that even if for some reason, then these two countries stop exporting these grains to those African countries, they will not necessarily be affected through the fact that they have direct access to food from these countries. The main effect would be through the channel, the price channel. And the reason I say that is that you have major, and I think Luis mentioned that, you have major trading companies, Bunge, Cargill, Dreyfus, that they operate all around the world. So what happens is that, yeah, they do operate in Ukraine, they do operate in Russia, but if something happens, if production is disrupted in these two countries, or even if it's not disrupted, but if trade doesn't flow from these two countries to their destination, market destinations, still, these companies are capable of remanaging their trade and find other sources of grains to supply those countries that have been importing directly from Russia or Ukraine. So that's one of the advantages of the fact that you have a globalized economy, you have global trade in grains, the fact that then if your supplier for some reason fails to supply what you are purchasing from them, it's possible to have access to grains from other countries. And I think that has been the case, because we don't hear that the issue that, say, Egypt is facing today is that they are not having access to certain grains, but the issue really is the impact that the crisis has had on prices. So that's the main issue, the impact on prices. And you mentioned that, yes, you have a lot of global food production. I think that's a positive. And the reason why that's a positive, Chair, is that we see today the threat to food security. And we have the issue of food insecurity almost everywhere in the world. That's a chronic issue. Food security is a chronic issue, and that has a lot to do with purchasing power among the poor and the most vulnerable. But one thing that perhaps that's linked to global trading and global trade in food is that what we don't see anymore as much as we used to see in the past is a different phenomenon related to hunger, but it's not hunger, it's not malnutrition, it's not starvation, it's even worse than that, it's famine. And we had a drastic reduction in episodes of famine around the world in the past several decades. Why? Because famine is a phenomenon very much geographically concentrated and a very severe phenomenon, which used to be caused by, say, natural disasters, war, natural disasters, drought, or war. And then these specific geographic areas, food didn't reach these areas. Yeah, actually, we do have that situation today in the world. Say, for example, in northern Ethiopia, we do have the risk of famine. Why? Because, yes, we have global trade, but then the war is ongoing, and not even food aid is reaching the area in conflict. So that creates the risk. But the number of episodes of famine has drastically reduced. And that, in my view, has a lot to do with the fact that we have global trade in food, that we have globalization. I'm not defending here globalization. I like the points made by our colleague panelist, Jose, but I see some positives in the way how the world economy operates. And the reason why we should not perhaps simplify the argument between freedom and prosperity, between freedom and happiness, or whatever you want to say, is that if you use freedom as a basis for everything and conducive to prosperity, conducive to happiness, the fact that it doesn't work that way, because if you have too much freedom, you give countries too much freedom, what you tend to have then is nationalism taking place, is export restrictions taking place, because these countries have the freedom to do whatever they want. They are not bound by rules. And that's why I think it's important to stress that point, that if you live in a globalized economy, we need rules, we need global rules to hold these countries into account, to obey to the rules, so that we don't have the risk of disruption. So today, we have this war, we have supply disruptions from two big source countries, but at the same time, we have other countries then filling the gaps. But if you don't have these global rules binding these countries and making them supply, so they could take the decision to adopt protectionist policies, to impose export restrictions, and then yes, then we'll have a major crisis and perhaps the risk of famine, which is something that became way less likely to happen in the kind of world we live today. So I stop that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ricardo, for such a. Are you still speaking?
No, I finished what
Can
I
you hear
wanted
me?
to say. I stopped. No, I said I stopped.
Okay.
I'm so sorry about that. I thought that I was clear.
Thank you so much for the information. You did talk about how Africa is an import-dependent continent, and as an African, it is worrying knowing that we rely on Ukraine, Russia, and Ukraine for grains, for wheat, for we could be producing enough for ourselves here, and this also points to the one of the points that Jose also mentioned earlier about this high dependency on other countries for food in certain countries, which is a situation that we currently seeing given the Russia-Ukraine war. And that was going to come to my next question: that how do we protect, or how can African? This now would I'm asking Alex this one. What should Africa do, to protect itself from geopolitical tensions like this? Today, it's Russia, Ukraine. It could be another region. It could be other countries. But what should Africa do to protect itself, or the world generally, countries do to protect themselves from geopolitical tensions as regards food security?
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry if you can hear the dog barking in the background. Someone's just come to the door. No, there's a lot to unpick in the last few statements, and indeed your own other question. I want to first turn to I guess it's actually a very old phenomena of almost romanticizing agricultural production and indeed kind of the countryside life. And you see it throughout history. William Blake's poems as the industrial revolution swept across England. And indeed, not to pick on you, Lanre, I know we're friends, but it seemed that it's almost like a romanticism of, oh, let's grow our own crops, let's be self-sufficient, we can all do this together. But then just wait till the disaster hits your country and you'll be left far, far worse than you would be otherwise. I don't see the benefit of what some of the panelists were mentioning earlier of really getting behind small-scale agricultural production. I don't know if I'm missing anything here, but small-scale agricultural production tends to be far more inefficient, as well as also worse for the environment. compared to large scale. And you mentioned earlier that theoretically the world has enough food to feed everyone in the world. The only reason we have that is because of large scale production. It's not because of small scale farmers. Small scale farmers can be very important to many communities, but it's not what makes the global agricultural market go around. And if we were reliant on small scale agriculture for all of our food, we'd probably be very poor and very hungry. And indeed, being self-sufficient shouldn't be something that necessarily African countries should strive to be. If we look at agriculture as a percent of GDP, in, say, two of the richest African countries, Botswana and Mauritius, it's 1.8% and 4% respectively, agriculture as a percentage of GDP. Whereas in the DRC and Madagascar, it's 44 and 25%, much, much more. And yet, where would you rather live and where would you rather kind of enjoy your life? Mauritius and Botswana or DRC and Madagascar? Nothing against those countries. I know there's a growing middle class in both of them, but the average income is far, far, far less. However, I would like to say I do agree with Jose in some ways in regards to kind of a global structure when it comes to the food industry, and particularly when it comes to subsidies. American, European, and now Chinese subsidies are a huge impediment on African producers. They artificially lower the price, which means African farmers get far less for their crops or other produce than they would otherwise. And it's a fairly non-partisan issue. Libertarian think tanks, conservative think tanks, and liberal think tanks have all pushed back against these huge subsidies. I mean, in America, I think they're spending almost $500 billion in between 2019 to 2023 just on agricultural subsidies. And that's undoubtedly keeping tens of millions of Africans in poverty. And Oxfam have done studies on that, looking at just cotton subsidies and just American cotton subsidies, keeping more than 10 million West Africans in poverty. So expand that out to all subsidies across all of Africa, and it's a huge impact. So just kind of building on from that, if we agree that agricultural subsidies from typically the EU, USA, and China are keeping millions of Africans in poverty, then I don't think it's also a stretch to say they're also probably killing tens of thousands of Africans each year who can't afford healthcare, the latest medicines, etc. So I think that's where everyone can find agreement, regardless of your political aisle, is subsidies in developed countries on agriculture is extremely damaging, especially to African producers.
Thank you, Alex. We already have a number of questions in the chat box, but I want JP to tell us, what efforts do we have to take, do nations have to take? Also as non-profit or advocates of freedom, advocates of food security, think tanks, everyone on the call, what should we do to eradicate food insecurity?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question. I wish that I had the answer for solving global food insecurity, but I want to perhaps build up from the previous statements, and I think that I agree with most things that have been said. And I want to give an example that perhaps ties Jose's and Alexander's statements together. Is that I think that when we look at a country and we see that they are struggling with their agriculture, and many often we can think that, well, we should give greater attention to small scale farmers, to the local farmers, and while also on the other hand we sometimes see we have these big corporations and they are perhaps competing in against these local farmers in a supposedly unfair way. And I think that in a market, we usually don't have just one or the other, right? You have the mom and pop supermarket, the local store, while you also have like Walmart giants, right? So you have different scales of productions that will be efficient at different levels of distribution. So you want to have the multinationals because they can buy from suppliers from all over the globe, and they can redirect their production really fast. They're really good at logistics. They are good at shifting their production in a large scale. So in some sense, they provide a stability for supply. But also at the same time, local producers are essential, especially when you have these big shocks and the global market prices for some food. So we want perhaps to rely on the local farmers who are in your area. The problem is that often some of these policies that are taken in together with these big companies, big corporations, are indeed hurting the local farmers. And one example I wanted to give is that United States aid for African countries, for example, has a policy that the food that is given, that is sent to those African countries more often, is food produced by US farmers. So when you start dumping rice, corn, and whatever grain you may think about in Africa, people have access to free rice, people will stop buying from their local farmers. And so you are essentially destroying local markets that are essential to food security in those areas. So I think that the problem, this is of course a special kind of problem that is very connected to the problem of subsidies, the problem of aid, this is structuring the local markets. And so I think we should indeed strengthen the local markets. But I think that this is not antagonistic to also having big companies being open to trade and diversifying your food supply in your country. So indeed, what we want is to decentralize. We want to rely on local farmers. We want to rely on the whole globe to providing food. And I think that is essential to strengthen the local markets, not because that we value the local farmers just because they're local, but I think that they can be often more productive because in many cases, at least you have less shipping costs. Right, you are right on the market. You don't need to send rice across the globe. But often the reason why these local markets are not as productive, it's not only because they're small, but the reason why they're small is because they never had the opportunity to develop and become more productive. Because again, property rights are not defined in these countries. They cannot enforce their contracts. You have unstable governments, you have conflict, and these companies and these local farmers cannot safely, they don't have any certainty to invest. And so it's very hard for them to become efficient and to compete in the global market. And I think that's imperative if we wanted to increase food security in the globe.
Thank you, JP. Very interesting comments there. So Jose, I'm wondering, what are some practical ways or practical steps in local market?
Thank you. I'll comment on what the panelists have also mentioned. You see that there's no agreement necessarily on everything related with big agriculture and small agriculture. The agreement is clear on this panel, is subsidies, and is one of the main agreements in global food systems. And it's surprising that we can't, across the ideological barriers, there's an agreement and we can't put enough pressure on European and American governments to get rid of those subsidies that are, of course, destroying the planet in many ways and creating unfair conditions for global trade. No? So that's the main point of agreement. The others are not. We disagree on many things. I'm not romanticizing small-scale food producers. I've seen directly the role that they have in protecting biodiversity, the potential they have on providing healthy and diverse diets that big agriculture doesn't. Big agriculture, on the other side, I see that many idealize big agriculture on how they have produced enough food to feed a planet, but they can't. They are not feeding the planet. They are feeding animals. They are feeding cars with biofuels because the market forces have led them also on that way, not only subsidies. It's market forces that have resulted in many ways in a food system that is feeding animals, is feeding other fishes, is feeding cars in many ways, and is creating actually super cheap clothes in this also market created in many ways, like this fast fashion industry that also is using some of the land, that could be used to feed hungry humans. So in many cases, it's been like that, and this is why there's a big need on many of us to work together, civil society, academia, international organizations for sure, and the government to support those that feed us, not those that don't feed humans, and that aren't, if they feed humans, they are doing it in a way that is not healthy. So how can we change that trajectory? And it's with a joint effort from many different stakeholders to realize that we have to focus on more complex solutions for food systems. And these complex solutions go beyond, and I'm going to oversimplify this, go beyond producing more calories to feed a greater population. And that has been the ethos of in global food systems for decades, probably like since the 40s or 50s. We need to produce more calories to feed a growing population. But that has resulted in malnutrition, in actually obesity, in hunger in many ways, and in agricultural practices, mostly from big agriculture, that are destroying soils, are depleting water resources, are decimating biodiversity. So this joint global effort has to understand and has to create a consensus around the positive and the negative impacts of different types of agriculture. And in like the priority of what I'm talking about is let's prioritize these local markets. Let's prioritize these local food producers, small-scale food producers that are actually feeding most of the developing world. In Peru, it's like that. Almost 60% of what we eat comes from small-scale food producers. In many other countries, it's around 70%. And if it wasn't because of them, we wouldn't be able to cope with this food crisis. So there's a strong argument to support these local markets, local small-scale food producers and fishers, farmers and fishers, and this needs to change. This needs a big change in the narrative of what are the priorities in our societies.
Thank you, Yose. I wanted to just make a point there. As much as I agree with you that local producers, while you were saying that, it reminded me of something that happened in my country, Nigeria, a couple of years ago. The president or the government thought that Nigeria is importing too much rice. So the government wanted to make Nigeria sufficient in rice production. So you know what it did? Closed all the land borders so that we would not be able to import rice. And in a couple of months, there was a hike in price. So one can argue that this is wanting to strengthen the local market or protect the local producers, but it resulted in a negative impact. So there is a thin line there. I think we'll still have to look into the details of how to strengthen the local producers, why not disrupting free trade? Anyway, Alex, to you, Africa now has been raving about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's been the momentum is getting high now. Do you think that, or what do you think? Because the problem of Africa is not just dependence or reliance on imports from Russia and Ukraine. There is conflict, there are supply chain, infrastructural problems, climate change. So there's a lot of these things. So what role do you think that the AFTA is something to help Africa solve this issue of food crisis?
Yes, I certainly think it is. The free trade area is probably one of the best opportunities, at least of the last couple of 3 or 4 decades, for Africa to create a far more resilient market in food security. And I think, Lanre, didn't you write an article for the IETP's website about that very issue? So
yeah,
if you were to visit the Initiative for African Trade and Prosperity's websites, you can see Lanre's thoughts on that. No, but it of course makes sense for free trade area. Just in case you don't know, it'll be 12 years now. They aim to remove 97% of tariffs on all goods traded between member states. It's a project of the African Union, and we've so far got 43 of the 55 countries ratified the agreement, and 54 of the 55 have signed it to basically say they are going to ratify it in the future, with only Eritrea not having ratified. So its main goal is to remove 97% of all tariffs. That is tariff lines rather than value. So the 3% which is excluded, there is a fear that that is going to be quite a lot of agricultural products potentially. However, saying that, I think it's still an immense opportunity. The African Union has been trying to make free trade areas, at least a continent-wide one, for quite a long time. And this one has really got the momentum that no other has. However, saying that, there is a concern that many of the biggest countries in Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and South Africa, and really they're the key players, aren't they, in the free trade agreement? They're almost 50% of the continent's GDP, 47%. You mentioned Nigeria shut its borders off just a couple of years ago, from August 2019 to, it was only March this year, they reopened them. That's not really an action of a free trading state. When the Ukraine war broke out and there was issues with Egypt's food security, they implemented a lot of export controls, implementing, was it Article 12 of GATT, ANC? I can't remember. They did a lot of controls, and South Africa is also focusing a lot on these various localization policies. And Algeria, I think the continent's 4th biggest economy, also did what Egypt did. So that's the problem is, on one hand, these countries are saying they're supportive of free trade, they've ratified it, and it has huge potential to liberalize tariffs. But then on the other hand, you actually look at the actions of many, at least of the biggest countries, and perhaps they're not walking the walk yet.
Thank you so much, Alex. We're about 4 minutes to the end of this. So I'm just going to read through the chat box, comments and questions. Okay, so Korede. Okay, Bello Safia is asking, what kind of scheme can be laid down to assist local farmers? Anyone want to take that on? What kind of scheme can be laid down to assist local farmers, local farms of farmers?
I can chip in.
Okay, go ahead, Yosei.
One of the proposals that many of us are making all over the world to support like local farmers is providing them with markets in some way. like governments, national, regional, local governments get food to support school feeding programs, for example, in poor and vulnerable areas that are facing high levels of food insecurity. But they get these food products from big firms and corporations because in many cases they could be more efficient at providing those like processed food, very homogenized, very few products, but they can provide that food. If these governments work with small-scale food producers, with cooperatives, to improve their capabilities in the long term so that they can provide food for these school feeding programs, they could provide these small-scale food producers with a market that is going to be stable in the long term, and that can provide them with what they are lacking in many cases, no? Like this stable market in the long term that also uses these capabilities of these farmers to produce diverse food that can be healthier.
Thank you. So there's also this one from, I'm sorry, Srikuma. Apologies for, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but this person is saying, the biggest problem in my country, India, is that farmers don't have the freedom to export as they wish. Export is regulated of a product, is regulated by government. When prices go up of the very same product, also farmers don't have the freedom to use most GMO. The regulations is the reason farmers are poor, remain poor since ages. Otherwise, India can supply many food products worldwide. What can be done is a million-dollar question. Exactly. We have a political party who have been fighting for free market and liberty in every aspect. It's very new concept to most Indians. What do you suggest for farmers in India? That's a question by someone. Maybe I will just read through all of these questions and comments, and then we get answers from the panelists to wrap it up. So there's also one from Korede Ologun saying, Africa is perhaps suffering the most from the ongoing war in Ukraine in terms of food insecurity. Yet, Africa has a lot of arable land. It is clear that governments in developed countries distort the food market from a business perspective. However, they do this because it favors their producers. Are we to take a CSR approach to food production? How do we rewrite the food story in Africa? Is it more of a funding issue because even value chains like storage are still underdeveloped in Africa? There's also Gabriel Musa said, despite measures taken by UN, why do you think the situation remains unchanged in the African countries? And there is a comment here, the connection between food, geopolitics, and economic freedom might be the result of global population growth, rising prosperity, and changing consumption. I think it needs a shift toward investing in renewable energy and so on. Fantastic panelists. It's been an interesting conversation, so much to learn. I'm sure I definitely would watch this the recording over. But to wrap it up, I would like each of you to give like final thoughts in like 1-2 minutes. We've discussed a lot, and I know that you may have to repeat what you've already said, but let's go home with your final thoughts and briefly. So, Mr. Ricardo, and you can as well attend to any of the questions that I read. Mr.
Okay,
Ricardo,
okay, thank you very much, Chair. Just wanted to finish then my final intervention, just to say that I think it's important, yes, I agree, to rethink current food production patterns, current food consumption patterns. All that is very important. Let's think about that. Let's work on that. I agree with that statement, especially because one thing we didn't mentioned much during this conversation was climate change. And so it's very important to think about that in the context of climate change. Now, I'm not so sure that the solution, I don't think, it's not clear, I don't think that anybody is defending that, it's self-sufficiency in terms of food production, simply because, partly because of climate change, because if a country is hit by a shock and then the whole country production system collapses, then that's a big issue. So we do need to have the ability to be able also to have access to other markets to be able to deal with these shocks. I think that's very important. And a big issue, if we're talking about food security today, is not so much shortage of food supply, but it's really the ability to be able to purchase food, to have the purchasing power to do that. And that's what is leading to food insecurity. That's what is creating the reality of malnutrition, of hunger, or even starvation. So we have to look at that. So the issue is not so much food supply, but it's access, the purchasing power to be able to buy food. So that's the key issue we're facing today. Thank you.
That's awesome. I agree that the ability to access, to buy, food is very important. JP, what are your thoughts to wrap this up?
I'm gonna chip in to just give in an extra comment and chip in on the comment about government creating distortions in the food market. And one phrase that I really like is that the price system is like a thermometer, right? And if you are in a crisis and the patient has fever, you want the thermometer to report the actual temperature. And establishing price controls or subsidies or some intervention on the scale of the thermometer may say that the thermometer is shows you, because you control the price, it will show you like 36 degrees Celsius for Americans. But that doesn't mean that the patient doesn't have fever anymore. So you're just masking the scale, you're masking the problem, but you are not addressing the issue. So I think that something that Alexander mentioned, that often in a time of crisis, government will start intervening either directly on the price or by establishing controls in the export-import. But it's especially in times in crisis, it's especially when the patient is sick, that we want the thermometer to be accurate and report the actual state of affairs. So I think that we should let the prices convey the information that is so important to go around the crisis, and incentivizing people to buy low and sell high, to do arbitrage and transform this difference between supply and demand to bring that to an equilibrium again, and create incentives to people to bring more food in. So I think prices are really important, and I'll just say that. Great conversation. Thank you all. It was a pleasure. Thank you for the other panelists. Great discussion.
Thank you, JP, for your submissions as well. Appreciate it. Alex, what are your thoughts to wrap this up?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to follow on JP, I think JP makes a great point that it is all about the price mechanism. But unfortunately, the way politics works is when a crisis happens, it's in politicians' interest to intervene. If they don't intervene and a crisis is happening, they get blamed for the outcome of said crisis. You could have done something. Why didn't you do X, Y, Z? If they do intervene and distort the price mechanism and make things worse, and this is of course counterfactual because we don't actually know truly, you can't really work out truly. I mean, maybe you can in academic papers, but the public isn't going to be reading them in-depthly. If they do intervene and things become worse, they can just blame the crisis. So there is an incentive for politicians to intervene regardless of what's happening. And perhaps I can end on a more controversial point. Is Ricardo mentioned this earlier on, he's 100% right. The prevalence of malnutrition across the world was falling for decades and decades and decades. Famine is almost non-existent outside of war zones. And that was the case until about 2020, when COVID hit, and then we had the Russian-Ukraine war. And we just simply don't know. We actually haven't had the latest data since the Russian invasion of Ukraine to know what impact that's actually had. But it's taken us back to levels of malnutrition, even at 2020. So levels of malnutrition will be about 10%, 11% globally, which will take us back to 2010 levels or so, which is still declining from the decades prior. So there is an argument that let's get the supply chains back on track. Once the conflict is over, things do truly open up again following the COVID interventions. Based on the last decades of data, it seems things will move in a positive direction once that's done, and once, as I say, the war's over and the intervention stops. So we are moving in the right direction. It's just from the last 3 years, we haven't been. And let's get back to how we were in 2019. And I imagine things will be moving. That chart will be going down and down and down in decades to come. We can do that. Or Jose might not agree.
Thank you, Alex. I agree with letting the supply chains get back on track, but we have to hear from Jose now to wrap this up. Jose, what are your thoughts?
Yep, thank you very much. Actually, it's been very interesting to exchange our different ideas and a few similar ideas that we share on how to address these structural problems in global food systems. Actually think that we're getting worse. We've been getting worse in the last decades, not only in the last couple of years. Hunger has been rising actually since 2015. One of the worst examples about the problems of not intervening a market have been with ultra-processed food. They have created terrible addiction to products that are very unhealthy. Sometimes I refuse to call them food products, just products. They don't have any relation with the original food products that were based on, but they are added with chemicals and other additives that are addictive for people and are very high on sugar, on calories, on sodium, on fats that are terrible for human health. And they have created a pandemic in many levels, an epidemic in many levels of obesity and malnutrition, on diabetes. The public health costs of the addiction to those products have been terrible in countries. I'm speaking to you from Mexico, and in Mexico, the power of these food supply chains of ultra processed foods is very high, and only recently it has been regulated with more information to the consumer about what they're eating, that is warning consumers on the dangers of these terrible foods, and also taxes on those products that hopefully will decrease the consumption of these terrible products for anybody's health. So that's one example. It was regulated for decades. The industries are pushing for more unregulation, but in the last couple of years, I see some hope that is going to be more regulated, that is going to get more taxed. These products are going to be more taxed, and also they are going to get the similar warnings like tobacco has, like cigarettes have all over the world. Thank you again for this great panel.
Thank you, Jose, for that way to wrap it up. And thanks everyone for tuning in, staying tuned, and contributing your questions and comments. We have come to the end of this episode of the Happy Alumni Liberty Dialogues. Until the next one, see you all. Bye.